Suddenly he looked at his watch, jumped up, and hurried out of the room, leaving me with Mr. Wolfsheim at the table. "He has to telephone," said Mr. Wolfsheim, following him with his eyes. "Fine fellow, isn't he? Handsome to look at and a perfect gentleman." "Yes. He's an Oxford man." "Oh." "He went to Oxford College in England. You know Oxford College." "I've heard of it." "It's one of the most famous colleges in the world." "Have you known Gatsby for a long time?" I inquired. "Several years," he answered in a gratified way. "I made the pleasure of his acquaintance just after the war, but I knew I had discovered a man of fine breeding after I talked with him for an hour. I said to myself, there's the kind of man you'd like to take home and introduce to your mother and sister." He paused. "I see you're looking at my cuff buttons." I hadn't been looking at them, but I did now. They were composed of oddly familiar pieces of ivory. "Fine as specimens of human molars," he informed me. "Well," I inspected them, "that's a very interesting idea." "Yeah," he flipped up his sleeves under his coat. "Yeah, Gatsby's very careful about women. He would never as so much look at a friend's wife." When the subject of this instinctive trust returned to the table and sat down, Mr. Wolfsheim drank his coffee with a jerk and got to his feet. "I have enjoyed my lunch," he said, "and I am going to run off from you two young men before I outstay my welcome." "Don't hurry, Meyer," said Gatsby without enthusiasm. Mr. Wolfsheim raised his hands in a sort of benediction. "You're very polite, but I belong to another generation," he announced solemnly. "You sit here and discuss your sports and your young ladies and your—" He supplies an imaginary noun with another wave of his hand. "As for me, I am 50 years old, and I won't impose myself on you any longer." So Gatsby goes because he has to essentially answer a phone call or make a phone call because of some business. And Meyer is left with Nick. And then Meyer starts talking about all these like super random things about Gatsby, as if Gatsby had already previously talked to Meyer about what he needs to say to Nick. He says, "Oh, he's an Oxford man. Yes, it's one of the oldest universities." And then he says, he would never so much as look at a man's wife. He's somebody that I would want to introduce to my mom and my sister." And so these very, very random comments are obviously planted in order for Gatsby to get Nick to think well of him. For, again, some random reason that we still don't know yet. So this entire day between the conversation in the car, the evidence in the car, the conversation between Meyer Wolfsheim, and then soon the conversation that Jordan's going to have with Nick is all in order to bump up Gatsby's reputation to Nick specifically. And then again, the other weird, sketchy thing that kind of proves that Meyer's involved in some shady business is the fact that his cufflinks are made out of human molars. And those human molars are not his own, because obviously he is talking clearly and isn't going to have his own molars on his cufflinks. So sketchy business, probably from a murder or beating somebody up or whatever. But that's why, Nick's like, "Oh yeah, that's an interesting idea." So then Meyer, and then again, as soon as Meyer is done with that conversation, he's just like, "Okay, cool, gotta go, bye. My job here is done," and then he leaves. As he shook hands and turned away, his tragic nose was trembling. I wonder if I had said anything to offend him. "He becomes very sentimental sometimes," explained Gatsby. "This is one of his sentimental days. He's quite a character around New York, a denizen of Broadway." Who is he anyhow? An actor? So Nick is not getting the fact that he's involved in the mob. No. A dentist? Meyer Wolfsheim? No, he's a gambler. Gatsby hesitated, and then added coolly, "He's the man who fixed the World Series back in 1919. Fixed the World Series. So baseball, for all you non-sports people, I repeated. The idea staggered me. I remembered, of course, that the World Series had been fixed in 1919, but if I had thought of it at all, I would have thought of it as a thing that had merely happened, the end of some inevitable chain. It never occurred to me that one man could start to play with the faith of 50 million people, with the single-mindedness of a burglar blowing a safe." "How did he happen to do that?" I asked after a minute. "He just saw the opportunity." "Why isn't he in jail?" "They can't get him, old sport. He's a smart man." So again, even more fact that Gatsby is connected to a sketchy character. I insisted on paying the check. As the waiter brought my change, I caught sight of Tom Buchanan across the crowded room. "Come along with me for a minute," I said. "I've got to say hello to someone." When he saw us, Tom jumped up and took half a dozen steps in our direction. "Where have you been?" he demanded eagerly. "Daisy's furious because you haven't called up." "This is Mr. Gatsby, Mr. Buchanan." They shook hands briefly, and a strained, unfamiliar look of embarrassment came over to Gatsby's face. "How've you been, anyhow?" demanded Tom of me. "How'd you happen to come up for this far to eat?" "Well, I've been having lunch with Mr. Gatsby." I turned toward Mr. Gatsby, but he was no longer there. "One October day in 1917, said Jordan Baker that afternoon, sitting up very straight on a straight chair in the tea garden at the Plaza Hotel. So this is now later in the day, and Nick is on his date with Jordan, and Jordan is now going to tell this sad story of what happened to Gatsby. So this is her talking and telling that story. "I was walking along from one place to another, half of the sidewalks and half on the lawns. I was happier on the lawns because I had on shoes from England with rubber knobs on the soles that bit into the soft ground. I had a new plaid skirt also that blew a little in the wind, and whenever this happened the red, white, and blue banners in front of all the houses stretched out stiff and said tut 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 in a disapproving way. The largest of the banners and the largest of the lawns belonged to Daisy Fay's house." So, the Daisy that we've met. "She was just 18, 2 years older than me, and by far the most popular of all the young girls in Louisville. She dressed in white and had a little white roadster, and all day long the telephone rang in her house, and excited young officers from Camp Taylor demanded the privilege of monopolizing her that night. Anyways, for an hour." So this is during World War I. Camp Taylor is right outside of Louisville, Kentucky, and frequently camps would hold dances in order to entertain and bring some cheer into the soldiers' lives before they were shipped off to fight in Europe. "When I came opposite her house that morning, her white roadster was beside the curb, and she was sitting in it with a lieutenant I had never seen before. They were so engrossed in each other that she didn't see me until I was 5 feet away. "Hello, Jordan," she called unexpectedly. "Please come here." I was flattered that she wanted to speak to me because of all the other older girls I admired her the most. She asked me if I was going to the Red Cross and make bandages. I was. Well then, would I tell them that she wouldn't come that day? The officer looked at Daisy while she was speaking in a way that every young girl wants to be looked at sometime, and because it seemed romantic to me, I have remembered the incident ever since. His name was J. Gatsby, and I didn't lay eyes on him again for over 4 years. Even after I'd met him on Long Island, I didn't realize it was the same man. That was 1917. So again, this is 1922, so it's a couple years ago. By the next year, I had a few beaux myself, and I began to play in tournaments, so I didn't see Daisy very often. She went with a slightly older crowd, when she went in with anyone at all. Wild rumors were circulating about her, how her mother had found her packing her bag one winter night to go to New York and say goodbye to a soldier who was going overseas. She was effectually prevented, but she wasn't on speaking terms with her family for several weeks. After that, she didn't play around with the soldiers any more, but only with a few flat-footed, short-sighted young men in town who couldn't get into the army at all. By the next autumn, she was gay again, gay as ever. She had a debut after the armistice, and in February she was presumably engaged to a man from New Orleans. In June, she married Tom Buchanan of Chicago, with more pomp and circumstance than Louisville had ever known before. He came down with 100 people in 4 private cars and hired a whole floor of the Sealback Hotel. And the day before the wedding, he gave her a string of pearls valued at $350,000. I was a bridesmaid. I came into her room half an hour before the bridal dinner and found her lying on her bed, as lovely as the June night in her flowered dress and as drunk as a monkey. She had a bottle of Sauterne in one hand and a letter in the other. "Gratulate me," she muttered. "Never had a drink before, but oh, how I do enjoy it. What's the matter, Daisy?" I was scared, I can tell you. I'd never seen a girl like that before. "Here, dears." She groped around in a wastebasket she had with her hand on the bed and pulled out the string of pearls. "Take 'em downstairs and give 'em back to whoever they belong to. Tell 'em Daisy's changed her mind. Say Daisy's changed her mind." She began to cry. She cried and cried. I rushed out and found her mother's maid, and we locked the door and got her into a cold bath. She wouldn't let go of the letter. She took it into the tub and with her and squeezed it up into a wet ball, and only let me leave it in the soap dish when she saw that it was coming to pieces like snow. But she didn't say another word. We gave her spirits of ammonia and put ice on her forehead and hooked her back out of the room. and the pearls were around her neck. And that incident was over. Next day at 5 o'clock she married Tom Buchanan without so much as a shiver, and started off on a 3 months' trip to the South Seas. I saw them in Santa Barbara when we came back, and I thought I'd never seen a girl so mad about her husband. If she'd left the room for a minute, she'd look around uneasily and say, "Where's Tom gone?" and wear the most abstracted expression until she saw him coming in the door. She used to sit on the sand with her head in his lap by the hour, rubbing her fingers over his eyes and looking at him with unfathomable delight. It was touching to see them together. It made you laugh in a hushed, fascinated way. That was in August. A week after I left Santa Barbara, Tom ran into a wagon on the Ventura Road one night and ripped a front wheel off his car. The girl who was with him got into the papers, too, because her arm was broken. She was one of the chambermaids in the Santa Barbara hotel. So Tom was cheating on Daisy right after they got married. The next April, Daisy had her little girl, and they went to France for a year. I saw them one spring in Cannes, and later in Deauville, and they came back to Chicago to settle down. Daisy was popular in Chicago, as you know. They moved with a fast crowd, all of them young and rich and wild, but she came out with an absolutely perfect reputation. Perhaps because she doesn't drink. It's a great deal advantage not to drink among hard-drinking people. You can hold your tongue, and moreover, you can time any little irregularity of your own, so that everybody else is so blind that they don't see or care. Perhaps Daisy never went in for Moore at all, and yet there's something in that voice of hers. Well, about 6 weeks ago she heard the name Gatsby for the first time in years. It was when I asked you, do you remember, if you knew Gatsby in West Egg? After you had gone home, she came into my room and woke me up and said, "What Gatsby?" And when I described him, I was half asleep. She said in the strangest voice that it must be the man she used to know. It wasn't until then that I connected this Gatsby with the officer in her white car. So, we're going to pause there and we're just going to review. So, Jordan's history of Daisy. We've got Daisy Faye of Louisville, Kentucky, who comes from the family who has the biggest lawn and the biggest house. So, very old money, Southern gentility. And in 1917, women would go and help the Red Cross and throw those balls in order to help out the army, one with their spirits and two with medical supplies. And then she meets Jay Gatsby, who is a lieutenant, which is, not a very high position in the army. And he's about to be shipped off. And so Daisy, again, in love with him, wants to pack up all of her bags and go to New York to say goodbye to him. And yet the mother stops her and says, essentially, you're not allowed to be with any soldiers because of the fact that he wasn't a man with a name. He didn't have a fortune. He was just some nobody. And her leaving to go to New York unchaperoned and by herself would have been a massive scandal because the assumption would have been that they're sleeping together and they're not married, which again in the 1920s was a big, or 1917 specifically, was a big no-no. So Daisy was heartbroken. And then Jordan comes in and she says, but next year Tom Buchanan comes. He's loaded. He's from a wealthy family. She's in love. She gets married. The family obviously approves, but the day before the wedding, she apparently gets this letter. We have no idea what the letter says, but we can probably assume that it's from Gatsby, either confessing his love for her, saying he misses her, telling her to not get married. We don't know, and that's part of the mystery and the mystique of that whole situation. And she essentially says, she takes that massively expensive string of pearls and says, I don't want to get married. And she's drunk and she's never been drunk before. So obviously she is absolutely torn with herself and heartbroken. And yet Jordan and the housemaid tell her, shape up, you're getting married. And she does. And she goes through with it. She has her baby. They travel. And Daisy is head over heels until she realizes that right after they got married, Tom was cheating with her on a chambermaid. So, that is the sad, sad story that Gatsby desperately wanted Jordan to tell Nick. And again, why tell Nick? Why not just tell Daisy? Why not just get Daisy to come in and, and what is this entire goal of that conversation and of this entire day where Gatsby is essentially going out of his way to make Nick believe that Gatsby is this educated, rich, wealthy man who is the perfect person to introduce to your mother and your sister.